Needles are broken up into categories according to their size and their gauge and their length, the taper length. So the smaller the gauge, usually the longer the taper is, and the sharper the needle is. You might already know from working with microblades that the sharper the blade, the finer your cut is. So when you think about working with a machine and you're powdering through an area with your needles, if you're using a really sharp, fine tapered needle, then you're going to get the pigment to penetrate into the skin a lot more efficiently. But it can also be more painful for the client. So this is something to be aware of while you're working. You have to be super careful to make sure that you're working really lightly. I'm going to demonstrate exactly how you'll do that. If you put too much pressure while you're working and you have a really sharp needle, like a 6 gauge, which is only 0.20 millimeters, then you're going to risk causing a lot of discomfort. If while you're working you notice that your client is bleeding a lot or they're really uncomfortable, then you need to consider your pressure. You need to consider if they're numb enough. You also need to consider if you need to change your needle. So I have actually had to do that on a few occasions where the client's just been a little bit too uncomfortable and I've just changed to a thicker gauge needle. So in a nutshell, the thinner needle is sharper. The thicker the needle, it's not as sharp. Basically, as cosmetic tattoo artists, we tend to stick to the micros and the nanos. If you're doing something like an eyeliner though, a nano would be too sharp. That's why I tend to work with typically an 8 gauge needle, which is your 0.25. In the quadron range, this is called a bug pin. You'll notice that it's labeled on the needle packages as a 1RL, 3RL, it might be just an L, so the number refers to how many needles are in that configuration. The letter refers to what the configuration is. So it's either a round liner, a round shader, micro, nano, or magnum. So we're not going to cover magnum today because it's not used for this technique that I'm teaching you. However, it is an important one to know about, in the future if it's something you want to look into. Needles is quite a vast and in-depth area to learn about. If you do want to learn more about needles and the mechanism of action behind each different size and configuration, if this is just a little bit too confusing for you, please reach out in the forum so that I can just send you a little bit more information. As you'll see here in this slide, we've demonstrated the difference between using a sharp object and a blunt object. So I know I've used a tomato here, but it's a really good example of how it affects the skin. If you're trying to, I know this is a horrible word, but if you're trying to slice into the skin with a blunt object, you're causing bruising and dinting. Whereas if you've got a nice sharp object, you're actually getting a beautiful clean cut. So a beautiful clean cut or penetration of the skin means less trauma, less downtime, better healing, and in this case you're going to have less swelling, so minimal discomfort as well.